How is it possible that we are in the middle of a pandemic, unemployment is at record highs, over 8 million Canadians have applied for the CERB, and yet our savings rate is increasing? That makes no sense. So I've got an expert on today to explain it, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
We get our paycheck and pay our expenses, and whatever's left over is our savings. So if you had to guess right now, how much money are Canadians saving? Intuitively, you'd probably say, well, we have very high unemployment due to the lockdown caused by COVID-19. So our incomes have dropped. We need whatever money we have to pay our rent and other living expenses. There's nothing left over to save, so our savings rate must be very low. Makes sense, but that's not what's happening. Our savings rate is going up, big time. To figure this out, I'm joined by Hilliard MacBeth, making his third appearance here on Debt Free in 30. He first appeared back on episode number 89 in May of 2016, just over 4 years ago, to discuss the first edition of his book, released in 2015, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. And he returned last year on episode number 251 to discuss the second edition of the book, released in 2018. We also discussed banking and how faulty economics contributed to the consumer debt binge. Hilliard, welcome back.
Nice to be back on the show.
Thank you for doing this. And you are in Edmonton right now. Is that correct, where you're coming from?
That's right.
So you are you got up early to do this. This is Wednesday, June the 17th. We are recording this. So just before 8 o'clock Edmonton time. So thank you very much for doing this. We will touch on real estate and debt. And, I want to start by saying here in Ontario, it certainly appears that the real estate market has crashed or certainly corrected. So I'm going to get your thoughts on that. But first, I want to talk about savings, because I got to admit, I don't fully understand this. So as I said in the intro, I would assume that, times are good. My income is high. I got money to save. So I put it in my TFSA and my RSP in the stock market and whatever. And then in bad times, when my income drops, I use my savings to survive, so the savings rate drops. That would make intuitive sense, right? But that's not what the numbers show. So, and you can correct me if my numbers are wrong here, but I did show prep for this, and the household savings rate in Canada peaked in the first quarter of 1982 around 21.5%. By the first quarter of 2017, the household savings rate was down to less than 1%. In the first quarter of 2019, so a year ago, it was up to 2.3%. And in the first quarter of 2020, it was 6.1%. And you sent me an email this morning showing me that the US savings rate has spiked to like 33% or something. So explain this to me. How is this possible? What is going on here?
So the key thing to understand about the savings rate, the way it's reported, and it's not quite the same as what we think of as savings. I write these weekend notes, which your listeners and viewers are welcome to join up for free. Just to find me on Twitter is probably the best way, and then sign up for the weekly report sent out to you. So it turns out that the way they calculate it is they take the total expenses and income and transactions, and if people are spending a whole bunch of money at the rate of consumer spending is like 70% of GDP, something like that, it has been on average, and of course some of that is not disposable income because there's always deductions from your paycheck like income taxes and all that sort of stuff, so the residual, the remainder that falls out of that calculation, they assume to be savings. And so when we get numbers like you just quoted, like 1 or 2% in Canada, what's really happening is that people are actually spending more money than they make, because there's automatic deductions from paychecks, things like Canada Pension and employment insurance. And if you happen to belong to a defined benefit plan, that comes off the top. And, for teachers, it's quite a large amount, like 10% or something. So obviously people only, if the residual of that calculation of all the transactions is only 1 or 2%, then people are overspending, and the way that's also basically the reciprocal of how fast is debt growing. So one of the basic fundamental factors in my two books about the housing bubble is centered on the fact that household debt has been growing at about 7% per year, which means in 20 years, it'll quadruple roughly. So what that 1 or 2% savings rate is really telling us is that people were going into debt at the rate of about 6 or 7% additional debt every year. And that was mostly through mortgages, but some HELOCs, credit cards, auto loans. I remember the first time I went to buy a car expecting to pay cash for the car. This is dating me now. You have to be really old to have actually paid cash for a car. And the salesman said to me, "Well, we're offering you a loan at 1%. Why would you pay cash?" I said, "Well, that's just what I do. I was sort of raised in that era." He said, "Yeah, but what do you do for work?" Well, I'm an investment advisor. People hire me to manage their investments. "Well, can't you make more than 1% with the money? Why would you give it?" So I ended up taking the loan because, like, what can I do? What can I say, right? So anyway, getting back to the savings rate, what it really is telling us that now that it's spiked up. Now in Canada, it's only spiked up to 6%. And in the US, they've got a different way of reporting it and more frequent data. So they've got it up to 33%, but it's obviously gone a lot higher than 6%, I think, in Canada. We'll see that in the next few weeks. What it really means is people are not borrowing at the rate that they were before. That's the bottom line. And they're not going and taking out those loans to buy a house. They're not going to take out those loans to buy a car. I saw something yesterday that indicated that they're even paying down their credit card balances, which is amazing. There was a negative rate on credit card balances, which has never happened in something like 20 years. So really the debt binge, this could affect your business. I don't know. The debt binge is coming to an end.
That's a problem then. So yeah. And I think what's happening in my business, you're right. As of right now, and again, we're recording this in June of 2020, the number of people filing a personal bankruptcy or a consumer proposal has fallen considerably. Less than half the number. If you go look at April, May, June, it'll probably be the same as July. And a lot of that is because, if I'm not working, nobody can garnish my wages, take me to court and sue me. The collectors aren't calling, CRA isn't collecting, so there's no pressure on right now. The question will be, when we get to the fall and the economy is reopened, I hope, and people are back to work, is that going to change? I assume so, but I guess we'll find out then. So so you're right. This if people are actually deleveraging, which is what you're describing, then this will have some impact. So why then is it that the savings rate is going up? Why is it that people are paying down debt? So again, if my income is lower because I'm not working, how is it possible that I have money to increase my savings?
So people don't really pay down debt. It's quite an amazing. We have a recent example was in the US, 2006 to 2010. And everybody knows the number in Canada, 170, it just came out last week, 177% debt to disposable income, the new record high. Well, in 2006, the US and Canada were identical, and the number was 140%. So, and then what happened was the US had the global financial crisis, and Canada really didn't get affected much by that. So the government of Canada and other people decided to use housing as a stimulus for the economy. So the debt went from 140% of disposable income up to 177% now. But in the US, it went down from 140% down to 100%. And it stayed down. So you say, well, gee, the people did a great job of paying down their debts and stuff. Well, no, what happened was that the debts got canceled. So when mortgages are defaulted, then basically the lender takes the debt and wipes it out, cancels it, and seizes the property, and then sees if they can sell it for how much they can get for it. So the process of deleveraging was accelerated in the US by the number of defaults, and I'm sure the same was true for auto loans and credit cards as well. So all the way along. So what people are doing now is they're not paying down their debts. Most people just, especially in a recession like this is going to be the worst recession since the Second World War. We thought the global financial crisis was bad. This is already twice as bad as the global financial crisis in terms of drop of GDP. They're not in a position to pay down their debts. If they weren't in a position to pay down their debts when the economy was roaring along, they obviously will be even worse. There's even less chance now. So what they're doing is they're just taking out new loans at a slower rate. So because there's always a turnover, right? When people make a mortgage payments, everybody's house, you're not allowed to buy a house without an amortization called a mortgage payment schedule. So there's a certain amount of, with $1.6 trillion of mortgages in Canada out in the system, every month a huge amount of money gets paid back just when people make their housing mortgage payment. And but then there's also a whole bunch of people who take out new mortgages and new car loans and new credit card debt and all that stuff. So it's the difference between the two that determines whether we're going deeper into debt or whether we're coming out of debt. And so what's happening now with the savings rate going up is people aren't signing up for those new purchases, whether it be a house or a car or whatever, as fast as they're paying back their loans. But there's no real chance of a meltdown in the total debt rate just by people taking out fewer loans. Although there was a lot of talk that's the way the bubble would kind of be gradually deflated, but it doesn't work that way. What the way that the deflation would work would be like the U.S. in 2006, 2010, where debts get canceled. That's the next thing. And I'm just thinking to myself here, how would that affect the savings rate? I don't know how that. Anyway, it probably doesn't make that much difference, the savings rate, because it's more of an accounting entry where you just cancel the debt. But the numbers change dramatically once people start canceling the debt. And in September, we've got the debt deferral cliff, as the head of CMHC, Evan, I guess he's just recently retired, Evan Siddall has called it, when the 6-month deferral on mortgages ends. And we'll see how many of the 15% of all the mortgages that are deferred become bad loans, and how many of them are just going to carry on and pay the 6 months in arrears and get right back into good standing.
So I understand I understand what you're saying, that we are getting new loans at a slower rate, and that makes sense because okay, my income isn't sufficient. I'm not going out and buying, new cars and new all this and new all that. So I can understand how that would make debt levels fall. I don't understand how that also then makes the savings rate increase. Are you saying it's really the same coin flipped over? It's two sides of the same coin, that, the teeter-totter goes this way. That's just how it works. They're really all that related?
That's right. In fact, they don't even there's no way to directly observe the savings rate. So what they do is they just think of it as the GDP, the gross domestic product, and minus what people spend. I'm oversimplifying here, but essentially that's what, this is the way it works. And the residual, the remainder that falls out of that calculation, they call it the savings rate, but it's just technically this money that didn't get spent. So you could say, well, that money, there's other things that could have happened to that money. It could have gotten buried in the backyard, but they have no way of observing that. So they just assume that people saved it. And what is savings? Nobody even knows really what savings is. Everybody's got their different way of thinking about savings, but so it's a very misleading term. I found a picture online of a savings book from 1950, which was handwritten by the, it would be the bank teller. This is really going to date me now. And what you did was you took your savings book into the bank, and they wrote, when you made a deposit of cash usually, they wrote a new entry in there, and then periodically they'd add a little bit of interest in there, and they'd update it. And it's actually a really good feeling. You came away from the bank thinking, wow, I'm really doing something positive for myself. My savings book is growing, and you took it home, and I don't know, like, what if you lost it? That question, I don't know. Somebody will know this. I don't remember how that worked. Obviously, it could be lost, but at any rate, that was your record of what you had in the bank. Of course, the bank kept a separate record, I guess, so they could recreate the savings.
Yeah, you'd probably be okay. This was in the era before Bitcoin, but I remember that too. I mean, I remember the savings book, and you take it in and actually meet with a teller. Well, that's not even a thing anymore either. So okay, so the savings rate is really just money that doesn't get spent, and so we shouldn't be reading too much into this. I mean, I'm trying to think of this from a psychology point of view, that, okay, times are tough, so I'm worried about whether I'll be able to retire on schedule, so I'm pulling back on my spending. Well, that's kind of what you're saying. If I'm not spending it, then that becomes savings. So even though my income is lower, I guess my expenses have dropped by even more than that, because I'm, pulling in my horns. And in tough times, we want to, have as much savings as possible to weather us through the future. Is that also part of what's transpiring here?
Absolutely. And the uncertainty. So John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, who gets a lot of things are attributed to him that incorrectly. He was a brilliant economist, and unfortunately now Keynesianism has this very kind of negative tone to it. But he was the fundamental part of his theory was the uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty can't be modeled mathematically, so that as you and I discussed a year ago on this show, the economics profession decided to just eliminate uncertainty from their equations. And but this was his key thing. And what he was worried about, because he was writing in the Great Depression in the 1930s, was people permanently getting affected by this uncertainty in their lives and starting to basically, you could call it hoarding. Let's move from savings to hoarding, right? So what happens is people become hoarders, both business people and individual consumers. They used to call them people, now they call them consumers. And when that happens, of course, that has a very negative effect on the GDP. And unemployment shoots through the roof, which means now that they save even more money because they're afraid to spend money. And all kinds of things happened as a result of that uncertainty. And what Keynes said was there was a possibility of a permanent equilibrium with a very high unemployment rate as money kind of got trapped in people's. Let's use an example, a picture of a hole in the ground in the backyard with a metal box where people actually took cash and put it there and just kept it there because they were so afraid. And businesses doing the same thing. So a whole part of the Keynesian work was to try and figure out how to get out of that trap. And it was very useful work. It was triggered by an emergency at the time. And unfortunately, Keynes had a heart attack in 1937 and then got drafted to work on the Second World War supervisory board that reviewed the economy, and they put a lot of controls on the economy during the Second World War, and then he passed away shortly after that. So we never really got to read more of his writing on how that would work. But so what happens is when the individual savings rate jumps like this and the uncertainty gets really high, the only entity in the equation, because businesses are hit with that as well, the only entity that has flexibility is the government. And that's why we're seeing in Canada things like $200 or $300 billion deficit. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We were talking, what, $20 or $30 billion deficit, and the opposition party was upset about that, as I recall. And it was only a few months ago. And now we're talking $200 or $300 billion. And in the US, of course, we're talking trillions of dollars. So the government expands its spending and everybody else shrinks their spending.
Well, so let's talk about that then. And I want to leave a little bit of time to get your thoughts on real estate and the stock market and everything else. But Let's talk about Stephanie Kelton. I believe you know who she is, right? She's
Yes.
an economist who is one of the, I don't know if she's the founder of it, but she's kind of the biggest proponent of modern monetary theory, MMT. And I'm not an actual economist. I just play one on this podcast, but my understanding, and she just came out with a book, I think last week, I think it was released June the 9th, The Deficit Myth, I believe. So the basic concept is we don't need to worry about deficits. All we need to worry about is paying the interest on the deficit. So, okay, Canada, we're going to have a $300 billion deficit this year, and everybody's all up in arms because how are we going to pay back $300 billion? That's a huge amount of money. What we're doing is we are burdening future generations with that obligation. And that's how it works with a consumer, obviously. If I go out and buy, take a vacation and spend $10,000 on it, well, on my credit card, I got to pay back that $10,000. It's a big obligation. But I guess as a consumer, there might be a situation where I go out and buy a house and I get a $500,000 mortgage. I don't really ever have to pay that back. I could just pay the interest on it, and 30 years from now when I'm going to retire, while I sell the house and pay it back. That's kind of the concept with federal deficits, that, okay, we're going to have a $300 billion deficit, but the federal government can borrow at like less than 1% interest. So the interest on that $300 billion is only going to be $3 billion a year. So long as the government can come up with $3 billion a year to fund the deficit, everything's good. We don't have to worry about it. Now, obviously, that's a cumulative thing, because if you've run a deficit of $300 billion every year, you're adding $3 billion more in interest costs. And we've been doing this for many years, so the cost can get really high. But my question then is, do we need to worry about deficits? I'm a debt guy. I'm a bankruptcy guy. I'm always worried about debt. And when I'm talking to consumers, I always tell them, yeah, we got to get you out of debt. That's a big issue. Is debt and deficits different for a government than for a consumer? Is this something we should worry about or not?
So it is different. So the problem with the whole discussion, one of the problems with the whole discussion, is that people tend to take the household analogy and apply it to the government. And the government is different from the household. So as you described, the household has certain constraints. If the monthly payments get too large, the householder has to come and see you and declare, make a proposal or declare bankruptcy. But the government is different in that the government is the monopoly issuer of the currency that the debt is made in. So the ability of the government to issue new debt to itself is, in theory, unlimited. And even the interest on the debt, interestingly, could be handled by just issuing more currency. Now, there is a point that's reached. There is a limit on the amount of spending and new money that the government can create, and that is inflation. So obviously, if the everybody in the country was working full time, maximum flat out, there were no unemployment, and the government decided to just all of a sudden spend $200 billion in a deficit by printing new money and pushing it into the economy, inflation would skyrocket, and that would be the limitation. But in the time of like the 1930s and probably what we're in now, the government can push $200 or $300 billion into the economy, and it won't have an inflationary effect. In fact, the CPI just came out this morning, and it was a negative number, 0.4%. I don't remember it ever being a negative number like that in a long time.
So can I ask you about that then? Because again, I don't get it. And I totally get what you're saying. If the government just keeps printing, then, I mean, one definition of inflation is an increase in the money supply. And we can debate whether that's an accurate definition or not, but let's go with that. Well, we have increased the deficit, which I assume means we've increased the money supply. And I get it. There's a difference between M1, M2, M3, and so on. But we've increased the money supply by $300 billion. And yet we have deflation, not even inflation. As you said, the CPI is actually negative. How is it possible that with all this, money printing or quantitative easing or whatever you want to call it, how can we possibly be in a deflationary environment right now?
Well, the economy is $2 trillion so in Canada. And if all of the businesses and all of the consumers, which are much bigger, in Canada, I think that the government's about 30% total consumer. Well, the government wouldn't even be 30%. The consumer is 70%. So all the other things are add up to 30%. So yes, the government has expanded its spending dramatically, but the decline in the consumer spending is so large that the government needs to actually spend more money into the economy to make up partially for the decline in the consumer activity. And
so is it true that consumer spending has fallen by more than the increase in the deficit? Is that theoretically possible?
It's possible. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but that's certainly what happened in the. It's interesting. I haven't studied the Great Depression as much as I would have liked to so far, but it didn't seem relevant. But now it seems more relevant. But the government, people, we make this mistake with history. We assume that people in the past were stupid and we're smart, right? So we think, they should have known what all they had to do was print more money, or all they had to do was, if only they'd found MMT or something, then there never would have been a depression. Well, that's not actually the way it went. What happened was the government, at least starting in 1933, when FDR got elected, they tried everything. They spent money. They tried to go to the private sector, gave them money to spend. Then they found that didn't work. Then they tried to do, and the programs. There's several of them. They all collectively are called the New Deal, but there's actually a number of different programs. Spending the money by the government was a tricky thing. A lot of it just got hoarded, right? So the government spend the money, and then the people that got the money would hoard it. So business people and consumers. So they had to find a way to spend that money in such a way that it was effective. So getting back to MMT, the annual deficit is just a record. This is what MMT says. Is just a record of the amount of money that the government has spent into the economy. And generally, since the 70s, since the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, people generally have felt that the government should be as small as possible. And so therefore the spending of the government should be as small as possible. Now we may be going back to an era when the government spending needs to be bigger, and because other things are happening in the economy. So the record we're going to have, I don't think we're ever going to get used to 200 billion, but we might have to get used to larger numbers. But the total debt in the economy is a record of how much the government has spent. It's just the mathematical addition of all of the annual deficits that the government has spent into the economy. It doesn't mean anything. There's nothing good or bad about it. It's essentially just an observation is what it is. So we tend to get excited because we say, well, yes, but we're burdening our grandchildren with this additional debt. Well, think about this. You and I both had grandparents, right? And the debt and the deficit when our grandparents were around was much smaller than it is today. Do we feel burdened with what our grandparents did to us? I mean, we walk around with a big resentment that our grandparents left us with this horrible debt that we'll never be able to repay. Of course not. We don't feel that it's our job that we have to repay all that debt. And in fact, if we even tried to do it, there would be a horrible depression because we'd be spending all our money paying back the government debt, and none of our money to buying new houses and cars and putting that vacation on a credit card. All of those activities that feed into GDP and make the economy go. So that argument though, so it's like, okay, let's assume that I'm a cigarette smoker, which I'm not, but let's assume I am. And let's assume I've been smoking cigarettes for 10 years and it's had no adverse effect on my health. Well, okay, maybe it just hasn't caught up with me yet. Maybe if I keep smoking for 20 years or 30 years, it's going to have a negative effect. Is it really the situation that, okay, we've been running deficits, but the economy has also been expanding, so therefore it hasn't been a problem yet, but it potentially could be a problem 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road? I mean, if we leave
So our grandparents left us a national debt of a few $1 billion. No big deal compared to the size of the economy. We may be leaving our grandchildren a debt that is twice the size of the economy or something like that. Like at some point, doesn't it become real numbers?
Well, at some point, you're absolutely right. There is a limitation on it. And what it is if the government spends too much money into an economy that's at full capacity, you get inflation. And inflation can become like in Germany in the 1920s or in Zimbabwe more recently. It can become runaway inflation. And what happens with that kind of inflation is the currency becomes worthless. So the government's put too much currency into the economy. The government has the right to say that currency is, we deem that currency by declaration, they call it fiat money. We deem that currency to be valuable, and that it's the currency of the realm. But if people decide because of inflation that they're not willing to accept that currency anymore, you get hyperinflation, and then you get a collapse of the economy. So that is a constraint, and but that's really the main constraint. And with deflation being the bigger worry right now, because of a lack of spending by businesses and consumers, the government will be forced to step up and spend that money. I mean, it's just like we talked last time about how the commercial banks created. The government isn't the only entity in the system that can create money. The commercial banks also create money when they take, mostly with mortgages. When people take out a loan, we talked about how that magic moment when that $500,000 appears in your bank account. Now they don't let you just take it and do anything with it. They make sure that it goes to the purchase of that house. They don't trust us that much. But that money did not exist. The moment you sign those documents, that is new money that's been spent into the economy. And what we've had in the last 20 years is an imbalance where most of the new money created in the economy has been coming from that commercial bank mortgage house purchase engine. And obviously that's over now. So what is going to replace that? We either go into a contracting economy, or we have another entity that decides to do the same thing. The difference between the two, which is enormous, is that the government, both the asset and the liability stay with the government, and they never really have to have an accounting like a family and a household would have to have, where they have to eventually pay off that mortgage or sell the house in order to pay for the retirement.
So, and I guess, my concluding comment on that topic would be, well, I guess let's see what happens over the next 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, you're right. If you push the gas pedal too much, you get hyperinflation, like in the Weimar Republic, like in Zimbabwe, and then it all goes, you got a huge problem. But I guess that's kind of like a consumer too. Well, I can put $1,000 on my credit card and my standard of living actually goes up because I was able to buy something. If I put 50,000 on my credit card, it's too much. So, okay, I want to hit two topics really quickly and maybe a minute on each one because we're already kind of going overtime here. But you wrote the book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. What are your current thoughts on Canadian real estate? I mean, there is no doubt. Well, I mean, it looks to me like real estate is going down, but I guess the stats from the real estate people say things are still great. What's your take on real estate right now?
Well, so really what happened, I think, was around 2017. The Toronto market peaked. I remember it was around April that there was that incredible surge. And since then, the CREA, the Canadian Real Estate Association, has been showing a benchmark price that has been rising a little bit for the last 3 years. But the average price, which they also show on their website, has been really flat since then. So essentially, I think we can take 2017 as the top. And in Vancouver, it was 2016. In Calgary and Edmonton, it was much earlier. In Calgary, 2014. Edmonton, believe it or not, was 2007 was the peak in the market, which gives us an interesting insight into human psychology, because the people in Edmonton still are pretty enthusiastic about real estate after being beat up for 13 years. So we're just in the very early stages of this, and in the last sort of 9 or 10 housing bear markets in the world that were identified by a service that I have, the average decline was 36%. So we haven't really seen much of a decline yet in most markets. On average, prices are just basically flat. But housing bubbles, they're either the prices keep rising or there's a crash. There isn't like a flat period that lasts for very long. So we're going to start to see I think we'll do at least the 36% that was the average. The U.S. did 40% in 2006 to 2010. People want to use that as a benchmark. That's probably fair to say. But it takes several years. It doesn't happen right away. In fact, it's amazing how long this particular unwinding, let's call it, of the housing bubble is taking. It's the government programs make a difference. The bank, I don't know how many mortgages are they willing to put out. That makes a difference. The psychology of the people buying houses makes a difference. It all is so complex that. But this recession is the next recession was always going to be the trigger. But this recession combined with COVID-19 is going to make it happen probably quite quickly from now on anyway.
Yeah, it's certainly accelerated things, I would think. So, but it's a valid point you make. It's not like I lose my job today and I sell my house tomorrow. It's a much longer unwinding. So I guess we'll wait and see whether your 36% benchmark comes true or not. We won't know for a year or two or three. So final question. Again, as I said at the start, things are bad. Unemployment is really high. Deficits are huge. And yet I believe last week, the NASDAQ stock market made a new high, and the TSX, the US markets, the Dow, whatever, are very close to the highs that they reached in February of this year, just before the crash. So I don't know what the numbers were. The markets went down 30-40%, and they have recovered almost all of that. How is it possible that when we've got massive unemployment, the real economy is clearly in trouble, the stock market appears to be, at least over the last month or two, doing great? Where's the disjoint here? What are we missing?
It's really hard to know. I mean, we obviously, we talk to a lot of people almost on a daily basis, and there seems to be two camps, and they're very, very far apart. One is, oh my God, let's get everything out of the stock market and put it into the safest possible thing like treasury bills. And the other call we get, and we often we get one like 5 minutes after the other one, is there must be some bargains. The market's going up. Let's get more involved. And so of course our take is more conservative than that in terms of being more cautious. And but obviously this is going to be the most expensive stock market ever, because the ratio of prices of stocks to earnings of companies is about to explode higher. It hit a peak in February, second only to the 1999-2000 dot-com bubble. It was a little bit below that in terms of the stretch of that ratio. And now with the collapse in earnings that we're going to see coming out, probably we'll start to see it more in October, November, when the third quarter results get recorded. It'll be obviously very expensive. So generally the best measure of stock market investing is, in my opinion, is what they call value investing. And we left, there's very little value at these prices in the stock market. So, and in the past, that's always resulted, as it did in 1999-2000, which is the similar period, I guess, in a correction in the stock market that would probably take us below March 23rd lows.
So you are not recommending going out, leveraging it, borrowing every dollar I can, putting it in the stock market, putting it in Bitcoin, putting it in whatever. Probably caution is more warranted now than anything else.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there you go. So that's probably where we're at. Well, we covered a lot of ground there. I really appreciate it. I don't think I've ever done a podcast where we talked about savings, modern monetary theory, real estate, and the stock market, but we covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate that. So the best place for people to keep an eye on you is on Twitter, as you mentioned earlier. And your Twitter handle is your name. Is that correct? Or
Oh no, I picked it a while ago. It's HMACBE, so the first letter of my first name and the first 5 letters of my last name. So, but if people type in Hilliard MacBeth, I'm sure it'll come up.
And there are not very many people named Hilliard MacBeth,
Yeah.
which is probably one of the greatest names in the history of the world. So kudos to your parents if they came up with that. What I will do is put in the links on our YouTube channel where this video will be, I will put a link to your Twitter feed. I'll put a link to the article you wrote where you put the picture of the savings book. I'll put that in, put a link to how people can get your book, which obviously has turned out to be pretty prophetic. I know you took some grief on it when it first came out, but you've ended up being proven, I think, pretty accurate on a lot of the stuff you said in there. So Hilliard, thanks very much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And hopefully next time we can do this back in the studio in Toronto when you're back in the same province. It won't be for the next few months though. So I'm glad you were able to do this over Zoom. Thanks very much.
Thank you and stay safe.
Great. Thanks. You too. That was my conversation with Hilliard MacBeth. And as I said, I will put links on everything on our YouTube channel. Thank you for listening. My name is Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.